The death penalty casts a long shadow over Iran. Supporters argue it serves as a deterrent and upholds justice within Islamic law. Critics, including international human rights organizations, argue its application is often arbitrary and violates fundamental human rights. Iran has consistently ranked among the world's top executioners. The use of capital punishment extends to offenses that do not meet the most serious crimes threshold under international law. This has led to widespread condemnation and calls for Iran to reform its legal system. By understanding its legal framework and human rights concerns, we can engage in a more informed discussion about the future of capital punishment in Iran. Iran's legal system is deeply rooted in Islamic Sharia law, which serves as the guiding principle for the country's judiciary and legislative processes. This religious framework forms the foundation of its penal code, influencing every aspect of legal proceedings and the types of punishments that can be administered. The Islamic Penal Code, IPC, outlines various forms of punishment, each with its own set of rules and applications. These include qisas, retribution, hudud, fixed punishments, and tazir, discretionary punishments. Qisas refers to retribution, where the punishment mirrors the crime committed, aiming to provide a sense of justice and closure to the victim's family. For instance, in cases of murder, the victim's family can demand the death penalty, which is seen as a form of justice in line with the crime's severity. Alternatively, they have the option to pardon the offender in exchange for blood money, diya, a practice that allows for mercy and reconciliation. Hudud encompasses fixed punishments for crimes considered violations of God's law, such as adultery and apostasy. These crimes are seen as severe breaches of moral and religious codes, warranting strict penalties. However, the application of hudud punishments has been widely criticized for its harshness and potential for abuse, raising significant human rights concerns. The IPC's broad definition of capital offenses has raised concerns about arbitrary interpretations and politically motivated prosecutions, which can undermine the fairness of the legal system. The influence of Sharia law and the broad definition of capital offenses contribute to the controversy surrounding its use, as different interpretations can lead to inconsistent and sometimes unjust outcomes. Reforms are needed to ensure the application of the death penalty aligns with international human rights standards, promoting justice and fairness. The legal framework governing the death penalty in Iran is complex and open to interpretation, necessitating ongoing dialogue and reform to address these critical issues. Iran employs various methods of execution, each carrying its own set of controversies. Hanging is the most common method, often carried out in prisons or publicly. Public executions, while less frequent, still occur and are often staged as spectacles. Stoning, while officially suspended in 2002, remains a legal punishment for adultery under the IPC. Reports of stoning incidents continue to surface, raising concerns about the gap between legal pronouncements and actual practice. Firing squads and crucifixion are other legally sanctioned methods of execution in Iran. The use of diverse and often brutal execution methods has drawn widespread criticism from human rights organizations. The persistence of stoning highlights the need for Iran to align its practices with its stated commitments to human rights. Reforms are urgently needed to abolish these cruel practices and ensure punishment respects human dignity. Iran's use of the death penalty is marred by systemic human rights violations. Defendants in capital cases often face significant obstacles in accessing legal representation, and trials lack transparency. Coerced confessions obtained through torture are a pervasive problem. Defendants are often subjected to abuse to extract confessions which are then used as evidence in court. The execution of minors is another grave human rights violation that persists in Iran. Despite international law prohibiting the execution of individuals under 18, Iran continues to sentence and execute juvenile offenders. Discrimination within the justice system further exacerbates human rights concerns. Women, religious minorities, and marginalized communities often face disproportionate sentencing. Comprehensive reforms are urgently needed to address these violations and ensure the protection of fundamental human rights. Iran's use of the death penalty has drawn widespread condemnation from the international community. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the United Nations have repeatedly called on Iran to impose a moratorium on executions. The United Nations General Assembly has adopted numerous resolutions calling for a moratorium on the death penalty worldwide. Iran has consistently voted against these resolutions, maintaining its stance on the death penalty. Several countries have imposed sanctions on Iran in response to its human rights record. These sanctions aim to pressure the Iranian government to address human rights concerns. The international community has played a crucial role in raising awareness about the human rights violations associated with the death penalty in Iran. Continued pressure and engagement are essential to encourage Iran to move towards abolition. One of the most controversial aspects of Iran's use of the death penalty is its application to drug offenses. This has sparked intense debate both within the country and internationally. Iran has some of the harshest drug laws in the world, with the death penalty mandated for a wide range of drug-related crimes. These laws are part of a broader strategy to curb the nation's significant drug problem. The rationale behind Iran's strict drug laws is to combat drug addiction and trafficking. Authorities believe that severe penalties act as a deterrent, discouraging individuals from engaging in drug-related activities. Critics argue that the mandatory death penalty for drug offenses is disproportionate and ineffective. They point out that such harsh measures do not address the root causes of drug addiction and trafficking. The execution of individuals for drug offenses violates international law, which restricts the use of the death penalty to the most serious crimes. International human rights organizations have repeatedly condemned Iran's practices. Drug offenses do not typically involve intentional killing, therefore many argue that the death penalty is an excessive punishment for these crimes. The use of the death penalty for drug offenses has had a disproportionate impact on marginalized communities. These communities often lack the resources to defend themselves adequately in court. Individuals from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and ethnic minorities are overrepresented among those sentenced to death for drug-related crimes. This highlights the systemic inequalities present in the judicial system. Reforms are urgently needed to ensure that drug policies prioritize harm reduction over punitive measures. Advocates suggest that focusing on rehabilitation and support services would be more effective in addressing the drug problem. There is a growing consensus among experts that a shift towards more humane and evidence-based approaches is necessary. By adopting policies that emphasize treatment and prevention, Iran could better address the complex issues surrounding drug use and trafficking. Ultimately, the goal should be to create a society where individuals are supported in overcoming addiction, rather than being punished with the ultimate penalty. This would not only save lives but also foster a more just and equitable society. While the Iranian government remains steadfast in its support for the death penalty, public opinion is more nuanced and divided. Supporters often cite religious justifications, arguing it is a divinely ordained punishment. Others believe it serves as an effective deterrent against serious crimes. Opponents, including human rights activists and some religious leaders, argue it is a cruel and inhumane punishment. They also point to the risk of executing innocent individuals. The debate over the death penalty in Iran is intertwined with broader discussions about human rights and the country's international image. Despite challenges, there is a growing movement within Iran advocating for the abolition of the death penalty. Human rights defenders and civil society organizations are working tirelessly to raise awareness and push for reforms. The international community and domestic human rights advocates have long called for reforms to Iran's death penalty system. These calls focus on narrowing the scope of capital offenses, ensuring fair trial guarantees, and improving prison conditions. One key demand is for Iran to establish a moratorium on executions. A moratorium would allow time for a comprehensive review of the death penalty system. Another crucial step is for Iran to ratify the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR. The ICCPR guarantees the right to life and prohibits the execution of minors. Reforming Iran's justice system is essential to address the underlying issues that contribute to the high execution rate. The growing domestic movement against the death penalty, coupled with sustained international pressure, could pave the way for meaningful reforms. The death penalty remains a deeply entrenched practice in Iran, despite widespread international condemnation. This practice has been a part of the country's judicial system for decades, and it continues to be a contentious issue both domestically and internationally. Iran's legal system, rooted in Sharia law, provides a broad framework for capital punishment. This framework allows for the death penalty in cases ranging from murder to drug trafficking, and even certain moral and religious offenses. The use of the death penalty is marred by systemic human rights violations, including due process violations and coerced confessions. Many trials lack transparency, and defendants often do not receive fair representation, leading to unjust sentences. The international community has responded with condemnation and sanctions, but these measures have yet to bring about significant change. Organizations like the United Nations and Amnesty International have repeatedly called for Iran to abolish the death penalty, citing numerous human rights abuses. While public opinion on the death penalty in Iran is complex, there is a growing movement advocating for abolition. Surveys indicate that a significant portion of the population supports reform, and public protests against the death penalty are becoming more frequent. Human rights defenders and civil society organizations are working tirelessly to raise awareness and promote dialogue. These groups are crucial in educating the public about the injustices associated with the death penalty and advocating for legal reforms. The future of capital punishment in Iran remains uncertain, but there is hope for meaningful reforms. Legislative changes, although slow, are being discussed, and activists are celebrating small victories that pave the way for larger systemic changes. Continued dialogue, advocacy, and a commitment to human rights are essential for Iran to move towards a future without the death penalty. The combined efforts of international bodies, local activists, and the general public will be key in driving this change forward.